October 1943, a classified report lands on Winston Churchill's desk at number 10 Downing Street. The subject is not tanks, not bombers, not battleships. The report is an SOE dispatch claiming that British intelligence has contaminated some 25,000 German U-boat crew uniforms with a mysterious powder. A boast recorded in wartime SOE reporting, though independent German logs confirming the precise scale are scarce. Picture this. German submariners clawing at their skin like desperate men, raw and inflamed, trapped in the cramped, sweltering belly of their submarines with no escape. SOE intelligence documented at least one patrol cutting its mission short. The crew convinced they'd been struck by some horrific skin disease. It was a field report so celebrated proudly, though it survives mainly in Allied intelligence dispatches. Rather than German operational logs, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, found itself gripped by what SOE characterized as a massive epidemic of severe dermatitis spreading through their ranks. According to Allied assessments, German forces were completely in the dark about Britain's role in their misery. They pointed fingers at lice infestations. They blamed tropical diseases picked up in distant waters. They accused their own men of poor hygiene. None of them suspected the real culprit, a tropical bean plant that British scientists had turned into a weapon and distributed through resistance networks spanning occupied Europe. This is the story of SOE's itching powder, the weapon that transformed German submarines into floating torture chambers without a single bullet fired or bomb drop got by. 1,941 German U-boats had Britain by the throat. Admiral Karl Dinitz's Wolfpacks prowled the Atlantic like hungry predators, hunting Allied convoys with devastating precision, sending merchant vessels to the bottom faster than British shipyards could possibly replace them. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just another naval engagement. It was an existential threat that could starve the island nation into surrender. Conventional warfare wasn't cutting it. Sure, depth charges worked when you could drop them on a submarine, but the real problem was finding the damn things in the first place across the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Air patrols provided some help, but massive gaps in coverage allowed the U-boats to operate with relative freedom. Britain desperately needed unconventional answers to this threat that could end everything. Churchill grasped this reality better than most leaders would have. When France collapsed in 1940, he established the Special Operations Executive with a directive that was as simple as it was audacious: set Europe ablaze. So would wage a different kind of war through sabotage, subversion, and what people politely called ungentlemanly warfare at the time. The organization recruited scientists, engineers, and creative thinkers who could dream up weapons that traditional military minds would dismiss as absurd. Among their innovations was something that sounds almost comical until you grasp the science behind it: itching powder. But this wasn't the harmless joke shop variety that schoolboys bought for pranks. So's version was a weaponized skin irritant so devastatingly potent that victims reportedly needed hospitalization just to cope with the effect. According to declassified records from the Imperial War Museum's So catalog, the powder was listed right alongside secret inks and incendiary cigarettes as standard stores for resistance networks operating behind enemy lines. The active ingredient came from Mucuna pruriens, a tropical legume known by various names including cowage or velvet bean. Its Sanskrit name, kapakachu, translates literally as "one starts itching like a monkey," which should tell you everything about what this plant can do. The seed pods are covered in microscopic barbed hairs called trichomes that are absolutely nightmarish when you understand their structure, according to medical literature documenting the velvet bean's effects. Each hair measures roughly 2 to 3 millimeters in length, with tips just 1 to 3 microns in diameter. That's thinner than a human hair by a factor of 20. These needle-like structures contain an enzyme called mucinane, a cysteine protease that triggers intense itching through both mechanical and chemical pathways working in tandem. Studies have found that even minimal exposure to these trichomes produces rapid onset itching in the majority of subjects, with peak intensity hitting within minutes of contact. The trichomes are so incredibly lightweight that hundreds of them weigh barely a milligram. A small container the size of a talcum powder tin could hold millions of these microscopic torture devices. The mechanism attacked victims on two devastating fronts simultaneously. Physically, the barbed hairs penetrated the outer skin layer and embedded themselves into the epidermis, stimulating nerve endings specifically designed to detect foreign objects invading the body. Chemically, the mucinane enzyme released upon embedding created a histamine-independent itch response. This detail was crucial because it meant antihistamine medications provided absolutely no relief to suffering victims, scratching only made everything worse, driving the particles deeper into the skin and spreading contamination to other areas, including potentially the eyes if victims touched their faces. The itching could persist for hours or even days depending on the exposure level, creating prolonged suffering that conventional weapons simply couldn't match, so developed and produced the powder at secret research facilities hidden throughout the English countryside, operating under the noses of ordinary British citizens who had no idea what was happening in their neighborhoods. Station 9 at the Fraythe, a former exclusive hotel near Welwyn Garden City, served as the primary research and development center. According to records from the Hertfordshire Archives, the facility operated under Commanding Officer Lieutenant Colonel John Dolphin and Chief of Scientific Research Professor D.M. Newitt. The physico-chemical section conducted research on biological and chemical agents right alongside their work on explosives and camouflage materials. Station 12 at Aston House near Stevenage handled the production side. Packaging and dispatch commanded by Colonel Leslie J.C. Wood, who many historians consider a strong inspiration for the character of Q in the James Bond novels. The facility employed over 1,000 personnel by 1942, operating like a factory for unconventional warfare. They manufactured everything from the iconic Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife that became legendary in commando circles to explosive rats stuffed with plastic explosive. Itching powder fit neatly into their catalog of special devices designed specifically for resistance networks operating behind enemy lines. The powder was packaged with characteristic ingenuity and attention to operational security. Disguised as ordinary foot powder tins or talcum powder containers, it could pass casual inspection and be smuggled into occupied Europe without raising suspicion among German checkpoint guards. Primary distribution routes ran through neutral Switzerland and Sweden, with the powder delivered to resistance members working in laundries, clothing factories, and other positions that gave them direct access to German military uniforms, official. So instructions were explicit and left nothing to interpretation. The greatest effect is produced by applying the powder to the inside of underclothing, with particular emphasis on garments touching the more tender parts of human anatomy. The implications were clear and deliberate. Greek resistance fighters conducted some of the first successful field tests, applying powder to bedsheets used by German soldiers quartered in local homes and barracks across occupied Greece. The results validated the weapon's core strategic advantage beyond anyone's expectations. According to Sofield reports, the Germans suspected absolutely nothing and believed they had fallen victim to common lice infestation spreading through their ranks. Plausible deniability was built directly into the weapon's effects by design. Symptoms could easily be attributed to parasites, skin disease, or poor hygiene rather than deliberate sabotage by resistance forces. In France, SOE agent Ben Coburn, one of the most successful operatives in occupied Europe who completed 4 missions and holds the distinction of being the longest-serving active agent in France, arranged for itching powder to infiltrate a laundry facility used by German soldiers and Gestapo officers in Troyes. According to Imperial War Museum records of Coburn's operations, the contamination spread through their entire uniform supply without a single arrest, or even a hint of suspicion falling on the resistance network he'd built. Norwegian operations reportedly achieved particularly notable results that became legendary in SO circles. According to later SOE histories and secondary works, the Lark mission operating out of Trondheim devised a creative delivery method that was almost diabolical. lining condoms with itching powder and selling them to brothels frequented by German soldiers. Primary archive documentation for this specific claim is limited, but the story appears in specialist histories, including Lee Richards's study of psychological warfare. The accounts describe numerous cases of German soldiers requiring medical attention for unexplained conditions. Whether fully accurate or embellished over time through retelling, such stories reflect the creative extremes SOE was willing to pursue. In their campaign, SOE's Stockholm office reportedly found another distribution vector by gathering German envelopes from Swedes with relatives in occupied countries, filling them with powder and mailing them back into the Reich. Every letter from home became a potential booby trap for German military, postal workers, and the soldiers who received correspondence from loved ones, turning something comforting into something torturous. The strategic thinking behind targeting U-boat crews specifically lay in understanding exactly how submarine conditions would multiply the powder's effects beyond anything experienced on land. German submariners already endured some of the worst living conditions in any military service anywhere in the war. No bathing was permitted aboard U-boats because fresh water was strictly rationed for drinking and operational needs. Crews on captured U-boats never bathed during patrols, instead cleaning themselves by swabbing with alcohol when conditions became unbearable. Men carried a single change of clothes and typically wore the same uniform throughout entire deployments lasting anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 months at sea. The environment inside a submarine was absolutely brutal by any measure. Engine room temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit during warmer months, creating constant sweating in cramped, humid conditions with no ventilation. According to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, which houses the captured U-505, 59 men packed into a pressure hull no bigger than a subway car, sharing just 35 bunks and sleeping in shifts. Some crewmen slept alongside torpedoes in the torpedo rooms, trying to rest mere feet from high explosives. Diesel fumes permeated everything, including the food they ate. Under these hellish conditions, itching powder embedded in underwear would become a form of prolonged torment unlike anything conventional weapons could inflict. Men could not change uniforms because they didn't have spares. They could not wash contaminated clothing because water was too precious. They could not properly bathe to remove embedded particles working their way deeper into irritated skin. The microscopic barbs would continue their assault, working deeper into skin that was constantly sweating, rubbing against fabric with every movement, and completely unable to heal in the hostile environment. Medical treatment was virtually impossible. At sea, because boat medicine chests were designed for combat wounds and common illness, not mysterious dermatological epidemics affecting entire crews simultaneously. The boat's medic, if they even had one, would be completely stumped by symptoms that made no sense and spread without any clear transmission vector. The psychological impact would compound the physical misery exponentially. Crews already confined in claustrophobic conditions, stressed by the constant threat of depth charge attacks and convoy escorts hunting them relentlessly, would find their concentration on critical duties completely compromised. Men who should have been alert for enemy action, watching instruments and scanning horizons, would instead be distracted by uncontrollable itching that demanded attention. Morale, already fragile in the U-boat service by 1943 as Allied countermeasures improved dramatically, would suffer further deterioration under the assault of invisible enemies they could not identify, locate, or combat. The October 1943 SO report to Churchill claimed contamination of some 25,000 U-boat crew uniforms, which if accurate would represent a significant portion of the Kriegsmarine submarine force at that stage of the war. SOE characterized the German Navy as the hardest hit by the operation, taking the brunt of this unconventional assault. Allied intelligence reported at least one documented instance of a submarine returning to port prematurely because the crew believed they had contracted a severe skin condition that threatened operational capability. How far such tactical harassment translated into measurable operational impact remains difficult to quantify from available records, but so considered the campaign a resounding success. The British Admiralty monitored effects through various intelligence channels, noting what they interpreted as lowering morale among U-boat crews, alongside observations of declining standards in captured submarines that fell into Allied hands. Whether directly attributable to itching powder alone or the cumulative effect of multiple SOE harassment operations working in concert, the German submarine force was experiencing personnel problems that conventional weapons like depth charges and air patrols had not created. German military medical services recorded dermatitis cases in their logs. But there is remarkably little evidence in publicly available German archives that any coordinated investigation linked the outbreaks to deliberate sabotage by British intelligence. If such inquiries occurred within German counterintelligence circles, they are not obvious in the material historians have published to date. The Gestapo ruthlessly penetrated resistance networks across occupied Europe with terrifying efficiency, capturing numerous SO agents and dismantling entire operations through torture and infiltration. Yet the itching powder campaigns distributed nature, involving countless anonymous laundry workers rather than identifiable agents with code names and radio schedules, appears to have made it uniquely resistant to counterintelligence penetration. The contrast with American efforts in similar operations illustrates precisely why. SO's approach represented a more effective model worth studying. The United States Office of Strategic Services developed their own irritant weapon called humid, a spray bottle designed to produce a fecal smell that French resistance fighters could use to publicly humiliate German officers on the streets of occupied cities. MIT chemist Ernest Crocker created a mixture of sulfur compounds intended to create an overwhelming stench of human waste that would cling to targets. The program was abandoned after only 2 weeks of field testing. The volatile compounds proved completely impossible to control in practice. Sprayers would usually end up just as drenched and stinking as the people they were supposedly spraying. The weapon backfired literally and figuratively, contaminating the very people it was supposed to empower and making them targets instead. By contrast, the British powder required no complex dispersal mechanism and left the saboteur completely clean and unsuspected. You simply dusted it on clothing and walked away. The comparison extended beyond individual weapons to overall organizational philosophy. OSS combined special operations with intelligence collection in a single agency structure, while Britain maintained rigorously separate organizations. This separation allowed SOE to focus entirely on sabotage and subversion, without the conflicting priorities that sometimes complicated American operations in the field. So, itching powder was just one weapon in a comprehensive harassment strategy that aimed to make German occupation uncomfortable at every possible level. Cacolube, an abrasive grease sometimes containing carborundum powder and packaged in containers resembling everyday items, destroyed vehicle engines when introduced into crankcases by saboteurs. The hot oil dissolved the container, releasing abrasive particles that damaged moving parts and caused catastrophic mechanical failures. Before D-Day, the SOE's Pimento network reportedly used young resistance members to drain axle oil from the 2nd SS Panzer Division's rail transport cars and replace it with abrasive compounds, contributing to critical delays of German armor during the Normandy campaign when every hour mattered. The cumulative effect of these harassment operations was intended to be genuinely strategic, not merely annoying. As SOE Commander Brigadier Colin Gubbins wrote in his foundational pamphlet, The Art of Guerrilla Warfare, the object of guerrilla warfare is to harass the enemy in every way possible within all the territory he holds, to such an extent that he is eventually incapable either of embarking on a war or of continuing one. General Eisenhower acknowledged after the war that SO operations played a very considerable part in the Allied victory in Europe. SOE was officially dissolved in January 1946. Its archives transferred to Syscontrol as the post-war intelligence apparatus reorganized. But the organization's true legacy lies not in its dissolution but in the doctrines and capabilities it pioneered that transformed modern warfare. The United States Office of Strategic Services partnered closely with SOE throughout the war, And OSS personnel who became CIA officers after 1947 carried British tradecraft and operational concepts directly into American intelligence culture. Operation Jigbera, deploying joint SO and OSS three-man teams parachuted into France around D-Day to organize resistance forces, directly inspired modern unconventional warfare units operating today. United States Army Special Forces trace their institutional lineage directly to Jedburgh operations and the lessons learned in occupied France. Station 12's iconic Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife appears prominently on the insignia of the SAS, United States Army Special Forces, and United States Army Special Operations Command, a direct visual link to SOE's heritage visible to anyone who knows what they're looking at. Ian Fleming, a naval intelligence officer who liaised with SO during the war, based elements of James Bond partially on SOE figures he encountered, including Commando Gus March Phillips, who led daring raids. The gadgets that delight Bond audiences in every film originated in the very real innovations produced at Stations 9 and 12 by scientists who turned everyday objects into weapons. The itching powder campaign demonstrates a fundamental truth that warfare's decisive factors are sometimes psychological rather than kinetic. A microscopic plant fiber, properly deployed against the right target, could potentially force a submarine to abort its patrol, an outcome that tons of bombs and dozens of depth charges frequently failed to achieve through raw destructive power. SOE's claimed contamination of 25,000 uniforms, if the figure is accurate, represented not just widespread discomfort but systematic harassment across an entire naval service branch. German submariners struggling with unexplained skin conditions in the sweltering confines of their boats, unable to concentrate on instruments and duties that required absolute focus, represented a distinctly British approach to warfare that valued ingenuity and creativity over brute force and overwhelming firepower. Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare understood what conventional military thinking often completely missed. When fighting a total war against an enemy threatening national survival itself, unconventional tactics could degrade enemy capability in ways that traditional weapons simply could not replicate. The Germans built a feared submarine force that terrorized the Atlantic and nearly won the war. British scientists found a way to make their uniforms a source of constant misery. How far this specifically changed operational outcomes and affected the war's course remains genuinely difficult to measure from the available records that survived. But as a demonstration of creative warfare thinking outside every conventional box, the itching powder stands as one of SOE's most distinctive and memorable achievements. The powder appeared gentle and harmless, like something you'd find in any bathroom. The effects were absolutely not gentle. That was exactly the point. That was British engineering and scientific ingenuity applied not to killing more efficiently, but to making life completely unbearable for an enemy trapped beneath the Atlantic with absolutely nowhere to find relief or escape from their invisible tormentor.